Hello, I'm Dan Borscher. This is ABC News Mornings coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. To our top stories in just a moment, but first we're keeping across this developing story. Authorities in South Korea have arrived at the impeached president's residence as they attempt to carry out an arrest warrant. And these are live pictures coming in from Seoul, where it's just past 8 a.m. local time. The warrant was issued for Yoon Sung-yeol earlier this week over his attempt to impose martial law last month. Overnight, demonstrators supporting and opposing Yoon held rival protests near the presidential palace, residence in Seoul. A number of people were reportedly detained. Anti-Yoon protesters are demanding his immediate arrest, while supporters believe the president needs to return to duty so he can normalise the country. He said he'll fight to the end and has urged his supporters to stand by him. So these are the live pictures from just outside. As you can see there, a big gathering of people, but of course, as well as police and security forces that have gathered there. And we will bring you updates as they come to hand into the newsroom right across today here on the ABC News channel. Well, American authorities now believe the terrorist who drove a truck through crowds in New Orleans, killing 14 people, acted alone. The FBI says US Army veteran Shamsuddin Jabbar was 100% inspired by Islamic State and posted videos online pledging allegiance to the group before carrying out the attack on New Year's Eve. The FBI had previously said multiple people were likely involved in the attack. Police shot dead Jabbar after he targeted revellers on the city's famous Bourbon Street. It's now been reopened and security has been tightened at a major football match taking place in the city today. Our North America Bureau Chief Jade McMillan joins us now live from New Orleans. Jade, what's the latest on the investigation?
Well, we're on Bourbon Street, Dan, such a famous part of New Orleans, a real tourist hotspot that became the site of such devastation after that deadly terrorist attack on New Year's Eve local time. This area did reopen to the public today. Crowds have been building throughout this afternoon. The sun is about to set, nighttime really being the time when activity here picks up and when you'd expect many of the bars and the restaurants on this famous street to fill up. There is music being played in the street, visitors, as I said, starting to pour in, but at the same time there is a visible police presence. There are also reminders of what took place here. People have started leaving flowers further down Bourbon Street from where we are now in memory of the 14 people who lost their lives. Police have clarified that death toll today. They had said that 15 people had been killed, but we now know that that figure includes the subject, Shamsuddin Jabbar. They have also said that they no longer believe that he was working with others to carry out this attack. They found an Islamic State flag in the trailer of the pickup truck that he used to drive through a crowd of people here. They say he also posted videos to social media hours before the attack suggesting that he'd been inspired by ISIS. Authorities were looking for others who might have been accomplices. They now say, though, that they've got surveillance footage showing Jabbar being the person who placed 2 improvised explosive devices in this area before the attack. Both of those devices were later dealt with safely. Police have also said today that they don't have any evidence at this stage to suggest that there is any connection between what happened here and the explosion of a Tesla Cybertruck outside President-elect Donald Trump's Las Vegas hotel yesterday. So at the moment, investigations are obviously still underway in New Orleans, also in Texas, where Jabbar was from. Investigators trying to speak to his family and friends and colleagues, trying to piece together how this US citizen and Army veteran could have got to the point where he carried out such devastating violence.
What I can tell you right now is that he was 100% inspired by ISIS, and so we're digging through more of the social media, more interviews, working with some of our other partners to ascertain just how to ascertain a little bit more about that connection.
And Jade, you mentioned, and we can see those people around you. Have you had a chance to talk to people? How are they feeling?
Yeah, I think certainly local officials and businesses are keen to see this area return to normal. As I said, it is a real draw card for this city, for this state. We are still in a holiday period, and there is at the moment a big college football match taking place. That was supposed to go ahead yesterday. It's known as the Sugar Bowl. It's a big deal in this part of the United States that had drawn people in from other parts of the country. That was postponed by about 24 hours because of security concerns, but officials had insisted that that could proceed safely. We spoke to people earlier today out in their team colours who had come to New Orleans for that game, shocked by what had happened, really saddened by what had happened, but were feeling confident that they could go with their families in safety to that event. This is also, I think, a really sombre moment for a lot of people, the reopening of Bourbon Street. I spoke to one woman, Gail Morris, who had come to New Orleans to celebrate New Year's Eve. Here's some of what she had to say about how she was feeling as this area reopened today.
Just in absolute shock. How could this is such a vibrant, festive city. People are so kind. The music is great. The food is great. The people are great. And it's just unthinkable that someone could do this.
How does it feel being back here now that it's reopened?
Very strange. We didn't even know if it would be reopened or not. We're leaving tonight to go back to Houston, but we just thought we'd walk over and see. And I said, I felt my heart hurting when I walked that first block.
So, Dan, this area reopening, as I said, things slowly getting back to normal, but those investigations are here and in Texas still ongoing, and the President, Joe Biden, says that he's being kept updated as they move forward.
North America Bureau Chief Jade McMillan reporting from New Orleans. Terrorism expert Dr. Levi West from the Australian National University says the lone wolf moniker is not a fair assessment of this particular situation.
Probably the point that's worth making about that terminology of lone wolves is that it's really sort of a misnomer. It misrepresents the role of ideology and of an organisation and its propaganda campaign in providing the material that inspires someone to commit an attack like what's happened in New Orleans. And calling it a lone wolf or a lone actor tends to suggest that this happens in complete isolation rather than it being part of usually a campaign by a terrorist organisation to inspire people to act individually and by themselves.
And so I guess the whole way that it's being described is a bit problematic then, because it makes it sound as though ISIS hasn't had any role in this, but you're saying that's actually not the case.
Yeah, I mean, this one's particularly interesting in that it's some time since Islamic State was prioritising that sort of narrative in their propaganda of lone actor operations or individual operations in the West. That content hasn't gone away, which is part of the challenge of contemporary terrorism and extremism, is that all of that material that provided inspiration for the litany of individual acts of terrorism that took place between sort of 2014 and 2018 still exists. It's harder to access than it was then when it was fairly easy to access via platforms like Twitter. But the challenge with anything to do with terrorist or extremist ideology is that the motivating material and the doctrinal and instructional material remains available in digital form if you look hard enough.
I'm really intrigued by that, Levi. So is the very term lone wolf itself, is that something that's been put out there and propagated by ISIS as part of their messaging to scare people?
Without going down a rabbit hole of the history of the terminology, lone wolves is a term that originates from the extreme right in the United States, as does sort of the strategy or the idea, the organisational structure idea that sits behind the idea of what the extreme right called leaderless resistance. The jihadist movement adopted it in part in the mid-2000s. They called it individual and small cell jihad. They're the same idea under different packaging and different labelling. As a strategy, it's a way of maintaining operational capability without raising the intelligence red flags that you would from having a cell of 6 people communicating with each other, let alone communicating back to a command structure. All of those communications raise risks for a terrorist organisation of being found out. So having people act individually dramatically decreases the potential for interception or intelligence collection or whatever the case may be. It has a long history. The term lone wolf is largely only used anymore by the media. You won't hear very many government officials from the Five Eyes community, at least, or Western governments using the term lone wolf. They might use lone actor. That being said, it has very much been incorporated into the jihadist narrative in their propaganda, so they are strong and explicit advocates of what they call lone jihad. So the challenge with it is trying to sort of use relatively neutral language that doesn't glorify the actions, and lone wolf is largely assessed to have been something that makes it sort of, that glorifies the activity.
And we know that there was a flag, an ISIS flag, in the vehicle that was used in New Orleans. What do you see as the link to ISIS? Because we haven't heard any claims from ISIS yet, have we?
No, and that's probably the really interesting thing with this particular attack, is that normally what you would see is some sort of demonstration or communication of a pledge of allegiance, or what's called a bayat, to Islamic State, and then in response Islamic State would release an Amaq news agency, what essentially amounts to a press release, claiming the perpetrator as a soldier of the caliphate or a knight of the caliphate, and endorsing that it was in fact an Islamic State operation, even though the relationship between the perpetrator and the organisation is largely one way. Right, the organisation's producing propaganda. The perpetrator is, for the most part, just consuming that propaganda. They don't actually have what we would consider to be a formal relationship with Islamic State, which can make it challenging from both a conceptual perspective, but also from a prosecution perspective. There's some really interesting case law out of South Australia around what being a member of a terrorist organisation actually constitutes in legal terms, which is a reasonably expansive interpretation of that, which is positive. But it is a very challenging thing to sort of get people to recognise that someone who's never been to the region, never dealt with anyone from the organisation, but through their actions and their beliefs winds up sort of being a member, if you sort of get the complexity of that. So,
And ISIS has been relatively recently putting out statements and putting out messages about attacks, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I think probably the big picture thing to keep in mind with understanding what happened in New Orleans is that Islamic State didn't go away. And there's some good pieces in the Australian press over the last 24 hours sort of touching on some of this. Whilst they were largely and fairly comprehensively degraded in Syria and Iraq, which is where US and Australian and other allied forces were directly confronting them, they largely relocated their centre of gravity to North Africa, and they remain and have been since the so-called destruction of the caliphate, incredibly active across North Africa. For instance, on the same day that the attack happened in New Orleans, Islamic State's footprint in Somalia launched an attack against Somali military facilities that killed 22 people. They are operating with a high degree of tempo in North Africa. They've been producing propaganda reasonably consistently, but not like they were in 2014 and beyond, when they had a proper media centre that was producing that whole sort of full court press of full spectrum propaganda. So they have been producing propaganda, they have been making calls, they've been trying to exploit what's happening in Gaza and beyond, but not the same sort of volume and frequency of English language content directly trying to inspire people to undertake attacks.
And look, just finally, given the nature of these kind of attacks, that they are typically individuals where there's not, as you mentioned, that back and forth of communications between them and ISIS, how can they be anticipated? And is there more work that police and security authorities need to be doing on this?
Yeah, so I think probably the thing that's worth pointing out in regards to New Orleans is that those things had been done, and if it wasn't for the fact that the bollards that would have stopped this perpetrator from undertaking his attack hadn't been being repaired in preparation for a big football game that's happening in New Orleans next month, I think, then he wouldn't have been able to drive down Bourbon Street, right? That in response to the litany of vehicle ramming attacks that happened between 2014 and sort of 18, we rolled out a whole litany of different strategies and approaches. It included things like hardening targets that we assessed to be high value to a potential terrorist and so on and so forth. And Bourbon Street is a good example of that, of it working perfectly, except for the fact that they were being repaired. Otherwise, they would have done exactly what they were supposed to do. Anyone who's spent any time in a major CBD has seen all of the various pieces of of target hardening that have been rolled out over the past sort of decade or so. In terms of anticipating it, it's exceedingly challenging and involves sometimes a bit of luck going the right way. For instance, it's been reported overnight that authorities were made aware of some of the more hardcore or inflammatory content that he'd posted, but this was hours before the incident took place. And the capacity for a large-scale federal government apparatus to turn that coming into the system into finding an individual, locating that individual, and then intercepting their operation is an extremely challenging undertaking. It's the reason why organisations like Islamic State utilise the strategy, is because it's very, very difficult to anticipate.
Dr. Levi West, Research Fellow at the ANU Research School of Social Sciences. Thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks.
The FBI says it hasn't been able to establish a definitive link between the New Orleans attack and a Tesla Cybertruck that exploded outside a Trump hotel in Las Vegas. North America correspondent Carrington Clark has been following developments and joins us now. Carrington, what more do we know?
Well, police believe they have identified the driver of that Tesla Cybertruck that exploded outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas. They've named him as 37-year-old active duty US Army soldier Matthew Livelsberger. Now, he is a member of the Green Berets, or he was a member of the Green Berets, which is a highly trained unit that actually works in counter-terrorism overseas. At the time that this explosion occurred, he was on leave from his post in Germany. They've identified him through a range of identifications, physical identifications, including his military ID and a passport that were found in that vehicle, along with multiple weapons. And they believe that he killed himself with a gunshot to the head just before that explosion took place. The explosion was caused by a combination of fireworks and also a range of fuels. But they said at the moment it appears that perhaps the bomb, which effectively a homemade bomb, was not as complicated as you might expect from someone who had such a long history of work within the military. And that's one of the leads that they're currently looking into. He was a decorated soldier. They are still working through to figure out exactly what was behind this and what might have caused him to do what they've now described as a suicide and bombing or attempted bombing of this Trump hotel in Las Vegas. Along with the death of the driver, 7 other people received minor injuries. But again, this is still the preliminary stage of this investigation as they continue to sift through the evidence available to them.
And Carrington, authorities are looking for any potential link between that explosion and the terror attack in New Orleans, aren't they?
Well, given the timing, it happened on the same day, just a few hours after the attack in New Orleans, but also because both of the attacks, or this attempted bombing of the Trump Hotel, used rented electric vehicles from the same company that allows people to rent vehicles from owners directly. They are describing them as there are similarities that are worthy of investigation, but they haven't found a direct link. But one of the other interesting similarities is both the men involved, the subjects in both cases, have US military experience.
Both of the subjects served at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. What we do know about that is it's a very large military base, and we have no record that they served in the same unit or even at the same years at Fort Bragg, something that continues to remain under investigation.
The FBI says this is now a global investigation because of the recent experience of Matthew Livelsberger in Germany. They've been talking to associates over in Germany, and they're trying to figure out a timeline of what led him to be outside the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. But also they're tracking the movement of the rented vehicle. And part of what they're asking for is for members of the public who might have been along the same route, particularly if they've used the same electric vehicle charging stations along that route, to get in contact, because they think they might be able to pull out data, particularly video footage from those vehicles, that will help to piece together exactly what those movements were and whether or not anyone else is involved. But the main takeout is that they haven't found a direct link between this explosion in Las Vegas and the attack in New Orleans, and it is possible that these are just coincidences and that there is no direct link, but that's something that they're still working through.
North America correspondent Carrington Clark reporting from Washington, D.C.